The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
The Vice President and I came to the Congress together, 1946. We both served in the Labor Committee. I've been there now for 14 years, the same period of time as he has.
That's an interesting point. The Nixon campaign kept trying to say that Kennedy was so young and inexperienced, which made no sense because they were about the same age, and they had, like Kennedy just said here, they had just entered Congress at the same time, and so they had been in politics essentially at the same amount of time. And then he'll go on to say about the difference between their political experience.
So that our experience in government is comparable. Secondly, I think the question is, what are the programs that we advocate? What is the party record that we lead? I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
The next question to Vice President Nixon.
So odd.
Mr. Vice President, since the question of executive leadership is a very important campaign issue, I'd like to follow Mr. Noven's question. Now, Republican camp.
So this next part, what he's going to talk about, was seen as quite damaging to the Nixon campaign.
In slogans, you see them on signs around the country, as you did last week. Say, it's experience that counts. That's over a picture of yourself, sir. Implying that you've had more governmental, executive decision-making experience than your opponent. Now, in his news conference on August 24th, President Eisenhower was asked to give one example of a major idea of yours that he adopted. His reply was, and I'm quoting, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Now, that was a month ago, sir, and the President hasn't brought it up since. And I'm wondering, sir,
that
if
wasn't
you can
helpful.
clarify which version is correct, the one put out by Republican campaign leaders or the one put out by President Eisenhower?
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Van Oker, that if you know the President, that was probably a facetious remark. I would also suggest that insofar as his statement is concerned, that I think it would be improper for the President of the United States to disclose the instances in which members of his official family have made recommendations, as I have made them through the years, to him which he has accepted or rejected. The President has always maintained, and very properly so, that he is entitled to get what advice he wants from his cabinet and from his other advisors without disclosing that to anybody, including, as a matter of fact, to Congress. Now, I can only say this. Through the years, I have sat in the National Security Council. I have been in the cabinet. I have met with the legislative leaders. I have met with the President when he made the great decisions with regard to Lebanon, Quemoy, Matsu, other matters. The President has asked for my advice. I have given it. Sometimes my advice has been taken. Sometimes it is not. I do not say that I have made the decisions, and I would say that no president should ever allow anybody else to make the major decisions. The President only makes the decisions. All that his advisors do is to give counsel when he asks for it. As far as what experience counts and whether that is experience that counts, that isn't for me to say. I can only say that my experience is there for the people to consider. Senator Kennedy's is there for the people to consider. As he pointed out, we came to the Congress in the same year. His experience has been different from mine. Mine has been in the executive branch. His has been in the legislative branch. I would say that the people now have the opportunity to evaluate his as against mine, and I think both he and I are going to abide by whatever the people decide.
Well, I'll just say that the question is of experience, and the question also is what our judgment is of the future, and what our goals are for the United States, and what ability we have to implement those goals. Abraham Lincoln came to the presidency in 1860 after a rather little-known session in the House of Representatives. and after being defeated for the Senate in '58 and was a distinguished president. There is no certain road to the presidency. There are no guarantees that if you take one road or another that you will be a successful president. I have been in the Congress for 14 years. I have voted in the last 8 years. When the Vice President was presiding over the Senate and meeting his other responsibilities, I have met decisions over 800 times on matters which affect not only the domestic security of the United States, but as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The question really is, which candidate and which party can meet the problems that the United States is going to face in the 60s?
Mr. Van Oker's question for Vice President Nixon. Mr. Vice President, in one of your earlier statements, you said, we've moved ahead, we've built more schools, we've built more hospitals. Now, sir, isn't it true that the building of more schools is a local matter for financing? Were you claiming that the Eisenhower administration was responsible for the building of these schools, or is it the local school districts that provide for them?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, your question brings out a point that I'm very glad to make. Too often, in appraising whether we are moving ahead or not, we think only of what the federal government is doing. Now, that isn't the test of whether America moves. The test of whether America moves is whether the federal government, plus the state government, plus the local government, plus the biggest segment of all, individual enterprise, moves. We have, for example, a gross national product of approximately $500 billion. Roughly $100 billion to $125 billion of that is the result of government activity. $400 billion, approximately, is the result of what individuals do. Now, the reason the Eisenhower administration has moved, the reason that we've had the funds, for example, locally, to build the schools and the hospitals and the highways, to make the progress that we have, is because this administration has encouraged individual enterprise. And it has resulted in the greatest expansion of the private sector of the economy that has ever been witnessed in an 8-year period. And that is growth. That is the growth that we are looking for. It is the growth that this administration has supported and that its policies have stimulated.
So, anyway, that was the debate that led, that's said to give Senator Kennedy the edge in which he won the election of 1960. It didn't help that in Illinois, a bunch of dead people voted. I mean, it didn't hurt. There's lots of corruption in Illinois even today. And unfortunately, have you heard that before? Lots of dead people made it on the roster who voted, so there was definitely corruption in the Illinois election. So anyway, Kennedy wins. Here's a picture of the new president and first lady, actually on their way that evening, the evening of the inauguration, on the way to the presidential ball. And this is just a clip of the famous inaugural address.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
So, probably the last time that there was a quotable moment from a presidential inauguration address. There's the map. It was actually the closest election in, as far as the popular vote in modern times. You can see there's only about a 2 million vote difference. Kennedy wins with 49.7% of the vote, and Nixon lost with 49.6% of the vote. very, very close. Before I get into the major international crises that the president had to deal with during his short time in office, I want to point out one of the important aspects of his legacy. Here he is photographed in Ann Arbor at the Michigan Union during the campaign when he proposes to establish the Peace Corps. If you're not familiar with the Peace Corps, it's a program in which still exists today, and Americans of all ages, well, often college age, sometimes between undergraduate and graduate school, take a year off and use their talents to go around the world and help people in third world countries with their knowledge and talents. So it's a organization that was established early in the president's time in office, initially by an executive order, but then by an act of Congress.
I'm sorry, can we back up a little bit?
Back up?
No, you don't have to go there, but I'm just still confused on the point of electoral votes.
Oh, the Electoral College?
I'm still confused.
Yeah, well, we're all confused by that.
Okay.
The Electoral College is really, a problem. So, originally, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they didn't trust the voters. So basically what happened is that the average people didn't get to vote. It's not until Andrew Jackson is elected president that there's actually a popular vote. Essentially, the states would vote, appoint members of the Electoral College who would then vote for their states. And so every state, depending on their population, is assigned a certain number of members to the Electoral College. And then when you go to vote in a presidential election, it's the only election that has this type of count. So when you go to vote, you're technically voting for the person who's going to vote for you, for the candidate. So you're voting for a candidate who's been assigned to vote for a candidate.
So where do they come from? When they come from Congress? Or?
They're appointed then by the states. Yeah, every state has a certain number according to the population, and so that's why the popular vote doesn't necessarily count because I mean, in general, the elections historically work out, not always, where the person who wins the election has both, takes the Electoral College and the popular vote. But, twice in, twice in 16 years that didn't happen. It didn't happen in the 2000 election, and it didn't happen in the 2016 election, where the person who became president actually lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College.
Yeah, because I worked the polls, no pun intended, back in 2012, and by the time I turned in all the ballots at 9 o'clock to the city, Obama had already won again. So I was like, my vote is in.
Because, no, not necessarily. It's definitely important to vote, but it does depend in the end on the Electoral College. So, but once, probably what happened was they were able to predict that enough states had gone for Obama in that election that they were able to say that he had won. But, I mean, there's been definitely discussions about changing it, but there's not enough support for change, because you have to have an amendment to the Constitution. And that's very, very difficult to happen. So they couldn't even pass one in the 1970s to give women equal rights. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So let's, next I want to move on to, we'll talk more about Kennedy's time in the as president and what's going on with the First Lady. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the three major international crises that he had to deal with, starting with the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis will be, of course, the Berlin Wall crisis, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis will be last. So The Bay of Pigs is when a U-2 spy plane, so if you recall the U-2 spy plane, which is a really advanced jet that was developed, I believe in the 1950s. And remember when Eisenhower sent it over Russia and it was shot down just before the Paris Peace Conference and caused a big international incident. So anyway, that program obviously continues. And flying over Cuba, and they discovered that there's a missile base being built. It's being built by the Russians. It would give the Russians the capability to deliver a nuclear missile, a nuclear bomb anywhere in the United States within a matter of minutes. And so obviously this cannot stand. So it causes a crisis. President Kennedy assembles a team of advisors. For the most part, most of his advisors wanted to take immediate military action in some form. One advisor, though, suggested that they could put up a quarantine line, basically blockade Cuba using the Navy. And that at least could buy some time to try to figure out a diplomatic solution to this crisis. And that's the route that Kennedy went with. It's seen as being the closest that the world has ever come to a nuclear war. And so it was a very, very tense time that occurred over over several days in April, as you see there, in April of 1961. And I totally messed all that up because I combined two different crises in one. So anyway, the Bay of Pigs, I was mostly talking about the missile crisis. Sorry about that. I am sick today, so I will use that as my excuse. The Bay of Pigs is when we try to overthrow the Cuban government. And by the CIA training Cuban nationals. It was a plot that was had come about during Eisenhower's presidency. It was pretty much ready by the time Eisenhower left office, but the military wanted to implement it, and it was too late. Eisenhower said he didn't want to do it because, of course, there would be ramifications. It would probably drag on. And so he said that it should be put on hold, and the new president should make the decision about what to do about Kennedy. Actually, when he comes in, he puts too much trust in the military advisors. And there was some scaling back of air cover, which proved to be disastrous. The whole situation proved to be disastrous. The CIA thought that the Cuban people would rush to overthrow the government once this insurrection occurred. That was not the case. And Kennedy was criticized by our allies internationally because of supporting a movement to overthrow a legitimate government, because the government in Havana that was headed by Fidel Castro had only recently overthrown the dictator Batista and very, very corrupt government that existed there. And so he was recognized as the leader. The government was recognized as being a legitimate government. And so this was a disaster for the new president, and it was a learning experience as well. He learned to seek advice from various quarters and not just exclusively listen to what the military advisors told him.
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents had been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy felt that a plan that he had inherited, under which a band of Cuban exiles were to liberate their own country, was one he could hardly turn his back on. Well, surely the United States should help get rid of a communist dictatorship in our hemisphere.
The CIA badly misled the new president, promising him an easy victory and an end to the Cuban problem. Kennedy agreed to the invasion, but demanded crucial changes to hide America's involvement. Just 3 days before the planned invasion, Kennedy denied any possibility of American intervention.
There will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
As Kennedy spoke, the invasion force was gathering. An advance wave of American bombers planned to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. The president, worried that this might reveal Washington's role, ordered the operation scaled down. On April the 15th, 1961, just 6 American bombers, disguised in the colors of the Cuban Air Force, took off from Nicaragua for a crucial attack on Cuban airfields. But with so few bombers, only 3 Cuban planes were destroyed. 7 civilians were killed. As they buried those who had died, Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
Continuamos preparando. Resistir nada.
We prepared ourselves to resist an invasion against all the forces we knew the Americans had at their disposal.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana.
Éramos los hombres más felices del mundo.
We were the happiest men in the world because we had the opportunity to return to Cuba, our homeland, to fight to rescue freedom and democracy so that our country could be for all Cubans.
American planes were to protect the invasion force as they hit the beach, but Kennedy, now faced with international condemnation for the initial bombing, cancelled the air support. Castro's remaining air force quickly destroyed the ships carrying vital ammunition supplies. Mistakenly believing that this was a full-scale American invasion, Cuba mobilized all its forces.
Los peores momentos eran los iniciales, cuando teníamos poca información.
The worst moments were at the beginning. We didn't have much information about the enemy. We didn't know if they were 1,000, 3,000 or 10,000. We didn't know what types of weapons they might have. We didn't know if this was a total invasion.
Si podía provocarse una invasión.
Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned. Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead.
Yo no me di cuenta de que esta misión ya estaba resultando imposible.
I did not realize that the mission was impossible until the last day, almost at the end.
Porque teníamos un exceso de
We trusted in our allies. We never thought they would forsake us or abandon us. We didn't think that they could betray the commitment they had with us.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
So, that was definitely a learning experience for the president. He had not, like Mr. Sorensen said, not been used to failure. So, Sorensen, by the way, spoke here at Macomb about 10 years ago, and actually talked about his experience as being an advisor to the president, and how he was the liaison to NASA when we were the United States was trying to figure out, we were behind in the space race. And so the president sent him to NASA to try to figure out how we could beat the Soviets in the space race. And our NASA said, well, the Soviets knew how to do basically everything except for land on the moon. They could send a rocket out to the moon and back. They knew how to send a rocket around the moon. They just hadn't figured out how to land on the moon because that was way more complicated. So Kennedy made the decision that NASA should begin work on trying to figure out how to land on the moon and figure everything else out after that. And it was that strategy that actually then did lead to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So, President Kennedy had his brother as an advisor. His brother was the Attorney General, and so after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he began to rely more and more on his brother's advice, and of course becoming more confident in himself as well. Anyway, the next major international crisis that President Kennedy faced was just a few months later, in August of 1971, the Berlin Wall crisis. Since the division of Germany and as well as the division of Berlin after World War II, while there were certainly checkpoints, there's really there's no physical barrier. So if you lived in Berlin, you could easily go back and forth from one side of the city to the other. You could close your door in the morning and go shopping in the free section if you lived in the communist section. And what was happening is that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were leaving every year. Eventually millions of people. It was adding up over the decades. And it was creating something called brain drain. And so it meant that all the educated people, college students, professional people, were leaving. And the worry was by the government that there would eventually not be enough people to maintain society at the level that it was. So the Soviets began to pay for the construction of the Berlin Wall. And it was really quite dramatic what happened, because all of a sudden, just one morning, they start closing off areas of the city, forcing people to leave their apartments, and bulldozing buildings. And many people had to flee just with the clothes on their back if they wanted to live in a free society. So this is a newsreel from the time.
As the communist barrier between East and West Berlin grows higher and stronger, the more determined grows the will of those in the East to escape. Along the border, East Berliners are forced to evacuate their homes as the communist police move to prevent their escape. Camera crews are harassed by reflecting mirrors in the hands of East German police, and water hoses are played on equipment. Nevertheless, our reporters are able to come up with a remarkable picture despite these hazards. Smoke and tear gas bombs sometimes boomerang on the East German troops. It's like a deadly game of badminton. East Berliners who have apartments facing the border take the long chance when they get orders to leave their homes for the interior. While an East German guard attempts to yank her back to prison, West Berliners pull her to a fire net and freedom.
poor old lady, please.
Heedless of danger, from 4th and 5th floor window, from any hatchway open to escape, they flee. This woman drops into a net held by alerted firemen. And then, as a tense crowd watches, she is followed by her husband. First, he throws out a few prized possessions. Determined to protect their people from such temptations, the East Germans are raising homes and buildings along the border and creating a 10-foot ditch to prevent autos and trucks from crashing the barrier. The East Germans don't seem to have guards enough to plug every hole. When a soldier's attention is diverted by others, a hole is cut in the barbed wire and Khrushchev's face is slapped again. Can capture but a few isolated instances of these heroic escapes, but enough to present a remarkable document of our time. Remember, these people are risking their very lives to chase something we too often take for granted: liberty. At times, the border guards seem to make but half-hearted attempts to stop their fleeing countrymen. They never use their guns within camera range, though there have been many reports of shooting. Maybe someday they too hope to sample the sweet taste of freedom.
So that was a crisis in which the United States and the president had to deal with. All leaves had been canceled. It was very tense. It was feared that the war would break out between the United States and Soviet Union. Fortunately, though, in the end, what happened was there was this understanding that Berlin would remain divided, and now with this permanent barrier between them, this tension over people leaving East Germany would stop, and so essentially the status quo remained and permanently now. The Soviets give up their claim that the West has to remove their troops from the occupied areas of West Berlin. And then finally, a year later, in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I already talked about, occurred with the U-2 spy plane discovering the installation of a Cuban missile base, and President Kennedy ordering a quarantine line around the island. And fortunately, there was a diplomatic agreement that came about. Eventually, actually, at the time, it was just assumed that the Soviets backed down. But in reality, what happened is President Kennedy offered that some of our missiles that were deployed in Turkey would be removed. There were other missiles that could cover those missiles that were being removed. So it was not a great loss for us, and yet it would be a great advantage to have construction stop, of course, and not and the Soviets not being able to have the missile base completed in Cuba. I found it interesting that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and all kinds of records coming out, and I remember back in the 90s learning about how eventually the missile bases, or the missile base was completed. Of course, average Americans, we didn't know anything about it in those days. So, but this was the closest that the world's ever come to a nuclear war. There was talk of evacuating Washington, D.C., but there was fear that would send panic and shockwaves across the country. Mrs. Kennedy was asked, the president wanted her and the children to go away, but she refused to do that. She said if something were to happen, she wanted to die with the president.
The Soviets seemed intent on testing the quarantine line that Saturday. A U.S. ship dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine in the Caribbean. And, most harrowing, an American spy plane on a mission over Cuba fell off the radar.
You hear the moment on the tape. A messenger comes into the room. You hear Jack Kennedy for a moment. He's flustered.
The U-2 was shot down. The fire and star.
We have said that if Russia shoots down one of our U-2 reconnaissance planes, we will immediately retaliate. We'll immediately bomb that missile site that took out the plane. And then we will prepare for an all-out invasion. And you hear in the background this chorus of voices. We said we will retaliate. We have to do it right now. You know what Kennedy says? He says, well, let's take a break, gentlemen. Time and again, when the hawks in that room, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff are insisting on invading, Kennedy pulls them back. He says, let's go to dinner now and talk about, the Jupiter missiles. Let's talk about a trade.
Kennedy could see the chance for a peaceful solution was slipping away. So he chose the person he most trusted, Brother Bobby, to take an urgent message to the Soviet ambassador in Washington. He was proposing a way out, which involved the U.S. giving up a set of redundant weapons, the newly installed Jupiter missiles in Turkey.
Kennedy repeats his demand for Khrushchev to pull out, says that time is of the essence. If Khrushchev pulls his missiles out of Cuba, the U.S. will, over the next few weeks, pull its missiles out of Turkey. The president was willing to back down, pull out the American missiles from Turkey, but only if that was kept secret.
The Strategic Air Command bombers are circling over the Arctic waiting for the go signals. Other bombers in the United States are being handed their target packets to bomb Russia the next day. In Florida, the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force is readying for the invasion. An invasion, war. If Russia's drawn into it, and it will be, these are Russians on Cuba, nuclear war.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their quaking and return to the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev accepts.
So, it's only really hours away from a war with Russia. So it was a very, very tense time. I've talked to people who lived at that time, and they said they thought that was it. So, actually, I met a guy who was on his honeymoon on a ship in the Caribbean at that time, and he said the ship was diverted about as far away in the Caribbean as you could possibly get from Cuba. All right, so let's change course a little bit, something a little bit lighter, and I don't talk about. Unfortunately, there's not time to talk about life in the White House and what's going on with the presidential family, and what the First Lady is doing generally in this class. But Mrs. Kennedy was extremely popular First Lady. She made it her mission to what she called restore the White House. The White House, of course, had been completely rebuilt under Truman. Not a whole lot of early fabric, original materials left in the White House. Mostly dates to the mid-20th century. Even much of the woodwork was built new in the 1950s. But Mrs. Kennedy felt that the White House needed to reflect the history of the nation, the history of the presidents and the families that lived there, and the cultural history, art, decorative arts, things like that, so that visitors could come and experience our history by seeing various objects relating to the various administrations and the nation's history. So, so she made it her goal to create a museum that the public could learn about our history. And she assembled committees with some of the nation's experts on American art, and many of the people on those committees were also important collectors, and even more importantly, were very wealthy, and therefore they could pay for things and donate objects, because there was very little government money that could be put into this project. And it proved to be extremely popular with the American public. President Kennedy, when he gave his okay for her to do this, he just thought it would be a nice diversion for her, it would keep her busy, and it proved to be hugely popular with the American public, and very good for his political career and his ratings and things like that. And this is actually a photograph taken because she did a 1-hour special that was filmed about what she was doing at the in the White House, and as a way to also bring in funds to help with future work, and they created a White House guide, historical guide, as well as creating a position for a White House curator, something that had never existed before. And the White House guide continues to be published to this day, and it helps finance and maintain the collection. And they even have all kinds of Christmas ornaments and souvenirs you can buy through their catalog nowadays. This is actually the White House guide from the early 1970s, because her plan wasn't completed until Patricia Nixon completed it, because of course Mrs. Kennedy was only First Lady for about 3 years. So here's the guide. You can see the work that Mrs. Kennedy did, and this is a clip about her restoration of the White House, and filming the special, which she won an Emmy for, by the way.
Jackie Kennedy spent much of her time and energy in the first year restoring the White House. She raised more than $1 million for the project, hired an expert on American antiquities and decorative arts, along with her favorite interior designer from Paris, and remade the stodgy old pile. Her passion for the project was evident, which Dr. Martin Luther King learned when a Kennedy aide, Harris Wofford, sneaked him into the private residence for a meeting with the president.
I should point out that when the Trumans gutted the White House, it was on the verge of collapse. So that there was a lot of unfortunate things that were done to it, because they didn't save a lot of historic material. Material that was saved ended up being thrown out because of the inflation created by the Korean War. And so in order to save costs, they had new woodwork made instead of putting back old woodwork. But anyway, and then when the White House was done, they had it decorated by a New York department store. So it was a lot of new furniture from the 1950s that had been in it. And so Mrs. Kennedy's getting rid of all that kind of stuff and trying to make it more historically accurate. Well, it's more decorated, but eventually, nowadays, it's more historically accurate. And the collections have been expanded greatly in the last 50 years.
Kennedy had to tell King that there would be no effort to get a civil rights bill through the first Congress. And it was a great concern as to how King would take this. And we got in the elevator to go up, and it went down instead, and Jacqueline Kennedy got on in jeans and soot on her face, and I introduced her to Dr. King, and she said, "Oh, Dr. King, I just wish you had been in the basement with me this morning looking at Andrew Jackson furniture, that you would have been thrilled down there." And we got off, and she said, "But you have other things to talk to Jack about." And I go, and I thought to myself, well, she sounded a little wacky, a little bit, and charming but wacky. King was completely mellowed by it. He said, "My, wasn't that something?"
The First Lady was so pleased with the results that she agreed to unveil her handiwork to the American people in an hour-long television special, A Tour of the White House, with Mrs. John F. Kennedy.
Mrs. Kennedy, I want to thank you for letting us visit your official home. This is obviously the room from which much of your work on it is directed.
Yes, it's attic and cellar all in one. She prepared assiduously for the day of shooting. The shooting took 7 hours. There were 8 cameras. The producer, Perry Wolf, was amused that between takes, she smoked almost nonstop, and he saw that every time she smoked, she took her cigarette and she dumped the ash on the beautiful tapestry bench that she was sitting on. But she performed impeccably.
Mrs. Kennedy, do you spend a great deal of time in the Lincoln Room?
We did in the beginning. It was where we lived when we first came here, when our rooms at the other end of the hall were being painted. I loved living in this room. It's on the sunny side of the house, and one of Andrew Jackson's magnolia trees is right outside the window. That night, Perry Wolf stayed around and showed them some of the early rushes, and when the lights came up, Perry Wolf told me that he looked over at Jack and he saw a look of pure adoration and admiration.
At the end, President Kennedy makes an appearance in that special, and he wasn't happy actually with, he felt like in the interview he didn't do as well as he could, so he actually asked if they could bring the camera crews back the next day and refilm it. Yeah. But yeah, he's very, very pleased with this project, so, which he initially didn't give much thought to. Of course, he was a politician. He really could have cared less about art and antiques. So, unfortunately, of course, his time as president was cut short due to his assassination on November 22nd, 1963. He had agreed to go to Texas to really, essentially they were beginning the presidential re-election campaign. The vice president had asked him to come to Texas. The vice president, Lyndon Johnson, of course, was from Texas, and had asked if he could come to speak with party members at various functions, kind of help to shore up the party in anticipation for the re-election campaign. And so he didn't necessarily want to go. He kind of did it out of obligation to the vice president. First Lady, who often didn't go on such trips, decided that she was going to go as well. And the day before, the 21st, when they left, they had a very nice time in Texas, and then they fly into Dallas the morning of November 22nd. In those days, the Secret Service would alert the press ahead of time, often several weeks ahead of time, of presidential trips and the routes that the motorcade would take, so that the public could come out and see the president as he was traveling through their cities. That was a huge error and something that was stopped after this, because what it allowed for then, of course, is people who wanted to harm the president to be able to come out ahead of time and prepare. So that's what Lee Harvey Oswald did. He worked in the Texas Book Depository building that was on the route of the motorcade. He was able to bring a gun up there and then wait for the president to drive by. And then that's how he was able to shoot the president, first in the neck and then I think a couple times in the head. So we'll see if this works. It wasn't working properly yesterday. I had audio but not any video.
Instead of working alone, don't we have a better...
In Dallas today, the spot where Kennedy was targeted 50 years ago continues to draw visitors from around the world. A tragedy from long before cell phones and the internet has a powerful pull for successive generations. This is how it was for the people who were there.
I had a sense of guilt for not being able to do more than I did.
By knowing the parade route, we were able to get at the very end, and we took the children and just walked past the crowd to where everything thinned out, and we could put them next to the curb so that they could see the motorcade as it passed.
As we approached Main Street in downtown Dallas, the crowd began to swell, and it filled into the street, off the sidewalk. There were just too many people.
What happens in the next few seconds is still endlessly debated 50 years later.
I heard a noise coming over my right rear shoulder. It was an explosive noise. I saw the president grab at his throat, lurch to his left, and I knew something was wrong. I jumped from the follow-up car and started to run toward the presidential vehicle. I had not quite gotten to the car, and the third shot rang out. It hit the president in the head, causing blood and brain matter and bone fragments to come out of that wound. Over the trunk of the car, onto myself, I turned and gave a thumbs down signal to the follow-up car crew that was immediately behind me. Then we screamed to get us to a hospital.
As reporters, police, and spectators rush to the hospital, the desperate condition of the president is becoming clear to his team.
When I pushed the door open for trauma room 1, the first thing that I saw was the horrific sight of President Kennedy lying on his back, and he had an operating room light shining on his head, which was covered in blood, and I could look down inside his skull cavity and see that the whole back half of the right cerebral hemisphere had been blown out by the bullet wound.
He was dead. Had it been another person coming in like that, they may have checked pulses and vital signs and pulled the sheet up open.
So Governor and Mrs. Conley, the governor of Texas, were with the President and First Lady in the presidential limousine, and Governor Conley was also shot, but he survived. With that, Lyndon Baines Johnson would become President of the United States. Lee Harvey Oswald was captured a few hours later. He actually shot a Dallas police officer and killed him. When he was approached by the police officer, he was found in a movie theater. And he's arrested, but before he can be brought to trial, he was shot by the Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who had connections with organized crime.
And the 1996 Atlanta bombing, a hero.
So Oswald is shot as he's being transferred from one station to a more secure prison facility, and he's being brought out through the parking garage, and the parking garage was just left open to anybody who wanted to come in. There's all kinds of camera crews there, and so this occurred on live television.
Let me have it. I want it. We went out by Captain Prince. There is a... He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. Absolute panic. Absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Detectives have their guns drawn. They're There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot at point-blank range, fired into his stomach.
He is shot.
He is shot.
Oswald, it is Oswald.
Man that shot the man, or do you know?
That is the man that shot the man.
Oswald had lived. He was an ex-Marine, and he had lived in the Soviet Union for a time. So he did have this connection with Russia. The Warren Commission said that he was the only person involved in the shooting. The Warren Commission was set up after the assassination to investigate this. I actually heard an interview with an author who had done a book on this period and the Warren Commission, and said how there were some witnesses who were not called. I think it's really interesting because they were communists. And at that time, it was there was this hesitancy to interview people with communist leanings. So I think there's some parts of the record that are not complete. I've actually never read the Warren Commission. It's enormous, at least 3 volumes. So, but it's out there in the libraries if you want to read it. President Kennedy's funeral would be based on the funeral of Abraham Lincoln, actually. When Mrs. Kennedy returned to the White House that evening, she directed aides to go to the Library of Congress to look up the details of President Lincoln's funeral, and actually had to get the director of the Library of Congress out of bed to open up the Library of Congress so they could go read the documents. So here's Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office aboard the presidential aircraft. He refused to leave Dallas until the president's body was on board, and then he refused to take the oath of office until Mrs. Kennedy came up front from the back where she was sitting with the president's coffin, and he wanted her to stand by him as he took the oath of office. She's still wearing the outfit that she was wearing when the president was shot, and it was still covered with blood. She would later say that she was sorry that she washed the blood stains out of it, that she should have left it so that people could see what had been done to the president. So anyway, Lyndon Baines Johnson is now President of the United States, and he embarks on a program. Of course, we talked about Vietnam last couple weeks ago, but one of his great legacies is his Great Society program, in which he tries to end poverty in this country. Actually, the country's economy was doing so well in the mid-1960s, before the huge expenses of the war, that the Great Society programs, when they're put into place, didn't need any additional taxes to pay for them. And it's a program in which the president created a system in which workers would go into some of the poorest areas of the country to help work with people, say in West Virginia, help improve the educational system, to help improve nutrition there. Unfortunately, of course, it was largely a failure, although there were certainly some programs that were, well, there was at least one that was successful. The Head Start program was started at that time, and that still exists today. Have you heard of Head Start at all? Nobody's heard of Head Start? It gives early education, like preschool education, to young children in usually in urban areas or poor areas. Yeah.
I know.
Oh, good.
And question, is this the same one as it says Great Society?
Yes. I actually went to Head Start. I lived in the city. Okay. Yeah, I lived in I lived like at Van Dyke and below 6 Mile Road when I was a kid, and so I was there.
So did I.
At 2 different times. Clearly. Anyway, the Great Society is certainly one of the parts of President Johnson's legacy. He was very concerned with the poor. As a young man, he had been a teacher in very rural, poor areas of Texas, and he did not grow up with a lot of money himself. And so he uses his power as the president to try to bring about some really dramatic social change. And you can see that with his ability to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. It had been introduced a year earlier under Kennedy, but really was not going anywhere in Congress. There was no support for it. Johnson, though, when he becomes president, he's able to use both his skill as a politician to get it passed, and certainly also it passes as a way to honor the dead president, and so it's something that is seen as also being part of Kennedy's legacy, but definitely Johnson is the one who made it happen. Johnson was apparently a very difficult figure, very large man, and he would totally get in your face and not take no for an answer. And he was able to bully many Southern politicians, senators and congressmen, for voting for this measure, making them do the right thing, even though politically it was very difficult for them to do because, of course, it was unpopular.
That's why we need Lyndon.
Pardon me?
We just needed him to sign it.
Yeah, and here he is signing it. You can see all the pens that he has because presidents, when they sign a bill into law, they break up their signature into small bits, just 1 or 2 letters at a time, and then hand the pens out as souvenirs. And here he is handing out a pen to Dr. King. So, the Civil Rights Act is a major achievement in the civil rights movement. And it gives equal access to all people in public accommodations. It has provisions to combat discrimination and promotion. So you cannot be held back because of the color of your skin or your beliefs. Strengthens the voting rights of African Americans, although in 1965 a Voting Rights Act will be passed because there were some loopholes in this piece of legislation. And also gives the federal government the authority to file lawsuits over desegregation. Because remember, the South is continuing to drag their feet, even though this is a decade after now, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Desegregation is still slow in the South. And so the Voting Rights Act in 1965 is then passed, closed those loopholes in the 64 legislation. So an example of how civil rights were still being ignored in the South was that African Americans could not go on long distance trips on public bus systems. It was something that was considered just that you could not do if you were black. You could not travel long distances with white people. So CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, which had been established in Chicago in the early 1940s to combat discrimination in Chicago in the 40s, organized this. I actually have a story about this I find really interesting and unfortunate, because one of my one of my college roommates, when he got a job in the early 90s, he was traveling. He worked for the auto industry, and he was traveling on business down south, and with a coworker who just happened to be black. And his coworker made them pull over as it was getting dark and get a hotel room, because he was afraid even then to be traveling in this rural area of Louisiana with a white guy as it was getting dark. So, and this is going to be, 30 years out for the Freedom Riders. So, the Freedom Riders were trained in nonviolence, and they would disregard the Jim Crow status quo of the South. They would go into bus stations and ignore the black area only or the white area only areas. And this was something that Southerners were adamantly against, and they were often attacked. I have a couple of videos talking about what happened to them.
Today marks the 50th anniversary of a violent...
So, this is from 2011, this report.
...stone in the struggle for civil rights. A near-fatal assault that put Anniston, Alabama on the map. And that's tonight's Weekend Journal. The legacy of a mob attack on a group of college students known as the Freedom Riders.
I will never forget Anniston.
Anniston, Alabama, the place where Hank Thomas nearly died. In 1961, Thomas was a 19-year-old Freedom Rider, one of 7 blacks and 6 whites who boarded buses bound for the South to protest segregated interstate travel. Were you frightened?
I'm 19 years old. You don't know enough to be afraid.
But that changed on May 14th. When the riders arrived in Anniston, they were met by a brutal mob which shattered windows, punctured the tires of the bus, and set it on fire.
They held the door, and I remember them saying, let's burn them alive.
Trapped, Thomas says he sought the easiest way to die.
I thought that if I breathed in the smoke, then I would simply go to sleep, and that's the way I was going to die.
But he got lucky. A fuel tank explosion scattered the crowd, allowing the riders to escape the flames.
It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard.
A new PBS documentary details that horrific day, and the one glimmer of hope, a young white girl who waded through the angry crowd with water for the suffocating riders.
And as soon as I thought she was going to be okay, I got up and picked up somebody else.
Her name was Janie. I will never forget her.
But for 50 years, Anniston ignored that infamous day.
Bring back memories.
Herbert Palmore was 14 the day the bus burned. Now a city councilman, he believes it's time for the city to come to terms with its past.
We still have resentment in Anniston, so that's something we have to put it to rest.
A group called the Spirit of Anniston is trying to start the discussion. They've created Freedom Ride murals and organized a photo exhibit. Muralist Joseph Geary hopes the effort helps Anniston heal.
Anniston has this bad reputation, and I think doing this was part of moving beyond it.
So this is a wonderful thing.
Hank Thomas returned to Anniston this week with a group of college students reenacting the rides and found a different greeting.
I'm so sorry.
A special moment, Thomas says, not just for Anniston's progress, but for the nation as well. What do you think about this country in 2011?
Mine is the American story, the good, the bad, but I wouldn't take nothing for the journey. America is a great country now.
During the return trip to Anniston, Hank Thomas met the son of one of the Klansmen who burned the bus. The son apologized and invited him to dinner.
The times have changed. That was good. And then this is just a little bit more about the special that was done 8 years ago.
One of the goals of the state of Mississippi was to break the congress of racial equality. In this ongoing chess game, the state of Mississippi felt like they had one more move that would ultimately crush the Freedom Riders, and that was to make each of them come back and deal with their legal cases individually. And if they didn't come back, they'd sacrifice their $500 bail, and the Congress of Racial Equality were responsible for that.
The mass arraignment of the riders was arranged for August 14th, 1961. And some of the riders at that point had gotten out of Parchment Prison. They were all over the country, in some cases all over the world. And it would have bankrupted CORE, it would have bankrupted the movement if they had not come back.
Dear Ms. Smith, the City of Jackson has informed our lawyers that all of us who were convicted and released on bond are required to return to Jackson on Monday morning, August 14th. We made the decision to be Freedom Riders, and now we are challenged to continue the ride. Jim Crow will not die easily. Sincerely yours, James Farmer, National Director.
I'm taking a trip on the Greyhound bus line. I'm riding the front seat to Montgomery this time.
Mississippi officials consistently misjudged the movement. They basically thought that Parchman was going to frighten off the Freedom Riders, and then they thought the idea of coming back for trial would also frighten off the Freedom Riders because they wouldn't want to come back to the state after going through Parchman.
I walked in Montgomery, I sat in Tennessee. Now I'm riding for equality.
Amazingly, I think all but 9 came back, far from running back to their families and submitting to the intimidation. They grew for their stature as nonviolent warriors. The rallies that they had in Jackson on August 14th it was like a carnival of nonviolence. I mean, there are pictures of them smiling. Even though it meant coming back to Mississippi, they came back willingly, in many cases enthusiastically, and it was an incredible victory for CORE. Not just in a legal sense, it gave you a sense of this movement culture that had emerged at Parchment.
There was that underlying togetherness, and it stood all of the tests that we were put through. We sang and we talked and we prayed, and at the bottom line, we worked together, regardless of who we were or where we came from. And we had a common cause, and that was to make things equal for all people.
Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down freedom's main line.
So that would lead to ruling that would make it illegal for separate waiting areas and travel in southern states amongst races. The March on Washington, of course, is one of the major aspects of the civil rights movement. Here's Dr. King addressing the crowds, and probably somewhere about 1 million people showed up for that. On August 28, 1963, it's where Dr. King made his famous I Have a Dream speech, a speech that he'd been working on for many months ahead of time, and giving versions of it in public engagements that he went to, including in the Detroit area. He spoke at Grosse Pointe South High School, I think it was a couple months, at least 2 or 3 months earlier than this, where he gave a version of this speech. And Has anybody heard of that or known anybody who was at that? In the past, I've had students who've had their parents and sometimes grandparents who had attended that talk. Yeah. Anyone go to Grosse Pointe Soft?
I've just heard about it.
You heard about it? Yeah. Good. So, Dr. King was a great public speaker. He was like sort of like a symphony. It starts slow and then kind of build up to this big crescendo at the end. And so what we're going to hear is about the last 5 minutes of it.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discourse of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrims cried. From every mountainside, let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all the soft children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Dr. King would then go on leave to meet with President Kennedy after that great speech. So, of course, his work would continue for several more years until, unfortunately, he was assassinated. The 1960s are a time of a great deal of unrest with political assassinations and protest movements. Freedom Summer of 1964 was when thousands of young people worked to register people to vote in the state of Mississippi, which had denied people for decades the right to vote. And three civil rights activists seen here, Andrew Goodman, James Earl Chanley, and Michael Schwerner were kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan and killed.
Freedom Summer is set in 1964 when it was decided that over 1,000 college students would go down to Mississippi and try to change Mississippi, because Mississippi was not really part of the civil rights movement. And the general thought was, don't go to Mississippi because you'll be killed.
The absolute hatred that was in their eyes when they saw us, everybody was in grave danger.
There were three things that Freedom Summer was set up to do. One was to register people to vote. And that was basically to go out, knock on doors, say, look, would you come down to the courthouse and register to vote? The second thing that Freedom Summer was set up to do was to have what they called freedom schools. And that was to teach young African American kids history, culture, all those kind of things. The third component was, out of Freedom Summer, they were going to take a delegation to the Democratic National Convention and challenge the all-white delegation of Mississippi. And on the floor say, you should recognize us and not this other delegation, because we are integrated and they're not. And that was one of the most dramatic moments in American political history when they did that. They wanted to vote. That made them a full first-class citizen, and unless they could vote, they didn't feel like they were part of America. So one of the lessons, one of the most important things is how important it was to people in Mississippi to vote.
This was a transformative moment. This was the first time they ever had seen a black Mississippian standing up for their rights.
It was definitely dangerous business to go down into some of those communities, and unfortunately, some people paid with their lives. So, as I'm sure you've gathered, the South really would drag its feet for a very, very long time, trying to avoid change. Certainly, many in the civil rights movement were frustrated about the slowness of how things were going. Young people especially were becoming frustrated. And so you have a new generation of people who start to question this idea of nonviolence, and people like Malcolm X saying that perhaps there should be violence if it's necessary to bring about change. And obviously that was controversial at the time. Malcolm X and Dr. King did not get along. Malcolm X could be very inflammatory when talking about the civil rights movement and white people, although he does mellow his views after coming back from making the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca. He talks about how not all white people were horrible, which does help, certainly. Part of this new idea, you see a manifestation of new groups. The Black Panthers in the Bay Area, San Francisco, emerges, calling on blacks to unite both politically and economically, and trying to protect their racial identity. They dress like paramilitaries in the Black Panther, and they take advantage of a loophole in California law in which you can carry weapons like shotguns openly. This definitely is definitely a new strategy, and definitely terrifies many people in America at that time as well. They had good programs like I actually heard one of the founders' wives speak a few years ago, and they had programs like breakfast programs for kids in areas of Oakland, California. So, but they were also, pushing the boundaries because these guys are dressing like kind of military style uniforms, and which is definitely worrisome. So, so when I was a student, when I was a little kid, reading groups, and my dad actually taught at Southeastern, and so I used to hear about the Black Panthers, and so I suggested, because they would say we should be like Pink Panthers was one of the suggestions for our reading group, and I said, they have the Black Panthers at my dad's school, why don't we be the Black Panthers? I thought it was a good idea. So, there becomes this a little bit of overlap. Obviously, college students are involved, both black and white, in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. But the student protest movement begins on college campuses to bring about change on college campuses across the country. And its blueprint or founding document actually starts here in Michigan. It was written by a college student from the University of Michigan, and his name was Tom Hayden. He was on a retreat with the student group Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, up in Port Huron, just north of us. And at that retreat, he writes actually a quite enormous document. I have a copy of it. It's about an inch thick. And it talks about student grievances and talks about all kinds of things, what's going on, ideas of the Cold War, talks about consumerism, things like that, and kind of the ideas that Americans are too concerned with buying stuff, things like that. It's a huge, long document. But anyway, it talks about students' rights on college campuses, which of course are limited in the early 1960s. There's curfews, there's dress codes. In some cases, my mom, she went to a private college, Marygrove, but on Fridays they would have to wear academic dress, which means like if you see Harry Potter, when they wear the robes like we wear on graduation, like on Fridays at Marygrove in the 1960s, they still wore academic dress on Fridays for big campus-wide rallies. And students were like, it's not 1850. We want changes. Women on college campuses weren't allowed to wear pants often. They had to wear dresses. And so
student protest movement was about bringing about, changes to all that kind of old-fashioned stuff. And it was often met with hostility by college administrators. Students would use sit-ins as a way, it was very successful with civil rights movements, and they would use sit-ins as a way to try to bring about change on campus. Well, the Port Huron Statement is the founding document of the student movement and the free speech movement on college campuses. And so it really starts at the University of California in Berkeley, in Northern California, where students were trying to bring about change, trying to be able to use university rooms when they weren't being used for student activities, when they were being denied. And so there was a huge protest that began there. And then you would see this occurring across college campuses across the country. Initially, like I said, about bringing about just kind of everyday change to campus. But eventually then morphing, you'll see it morph into anti-war protests as time goes on, as the Civil War, as the Vietnam War becomes unpopular in 1967, 68, 69. So I think we're going to have to end here. We'll finish up chapter 27 when I see you on Thursday, and we'll hopefully, there should be time to review for the final test on Monday. Remember, Monday is the final unit test, and then the optional final exam, cumulative exam, is next Wednesday. That will only help you if you take it.
Tuesday and Thursday, right?
Tuesday and Thursday.
Good luck with today's lesson.